Imagine you're behind enemy wire. No map, no allies outside these walls. Everyone around you, the guards, the commandant, even some of your fellow prisoners, thinks your story ends here, in this compound, ringed with barbed wire and watchtowers. The routine becomes your prison as much as the fence. Roll call, gray suit, cold bunks, waiting. But what they don't know, what they can't afford to know, is that if you get out, you don't just save yourself. You punch a hole straight through their war plans. This is not the Hollywood version. There are no motorcycles revving over coiled wire, no orchestral swells as the hero clears the last fence. The real escapes of World War II were uglier, stranger, and infinitely more dangerous than anything a script could sanitize. They were operations, covert, meticulous, sometimes suicidal, and the men who pulled them off became something far more valuable than free prisoners. They became intelligence assets, living maps, proof that the regime was not invincible. Every searchlight sweeping across a prison yard, every sentry pacing the wire, every locked gate was a statement. You are contained, you are controlled, you will not rejoin the war. And every successful escape was a reply, written in forged papers and tunnel dirt and frostbitten feet. We refuse your ending. Consider what it meant to the Axis powers when certain prisoners escaped. Not the rank-and-file infantryman, valuable as any soldier is, but the downed bomber pilot who knew flight patterns over Berlin, the intelligence officer who had seen the code books, the resistance leader who carried in his head the names and locations of every underground cell in occupied France. These were not just bodies in bunks, they were walking vulnerabilities. From Berlin's perspective, capturing them was only half the battle. Keeping them was the other half, and that half turned out to be far harder than anyone anticipated. Here's the question no one wants to ask out loud. If you were running a war, who would terrify you more? An enemy with a gun or an enemy with a map of your weak points and the will to crawl home through hell to tell people exactly where to hit you? The camps were supposed to solve this problem. High walls, remote locations, guard dogs, searchlights every 30 seconds, entire security apparatuses built around one simple principle: containment. But here's what the architects of these systems didn't account for: human ingenuity scales with desperation. And when you lock up officers trained in engineering, navigation, forgery, and tactical planning, you're not neutralizing a threat. You're concentrating expertise. The wire wasn't just a barrier, it became a laboratory. Let's be specific about what the Axis powers feared. A downed Royal Air Force pilot sitting in a camp in East Prussia didn't just represent one less plane in the sky. He represented intimate knowledge of bombing routes, squadron tactics, aircraft capabilities, and target selection processes. Interrogate him badly or hold him carelessly, and he might escape with all of that still locked inside his skull, ready to be debriefed in London within weeks. An intelligence officer from the Special Operations Executive knew things that could unravel entire networks: code procedures, radio frequencies, drop zones, safe houses, the faces and cover identities of agents still operating behind enemy lines. His escape wasn't just embarrassing, it was operationally catastrophic. Resistance leaders were perhaps the most dangerous prisoners of all. They didn't need to carry documents. The intelligence was woven into their memory. Who could be trusted? Who was compromised? Which routes were blown? Which Nazi officials could be bribed or blackmailed? Lose one of them, and the entire occupation structure in a region had to assume it was mapped and exposed. The Germans understood this calculus. That's why certain camps were designated for high-value prisoners. That's why escape attempts by officers were treated with far more alarm than those by enlisted men. That's why reprisals, when they came, were so swift and so brutal. But understanding the threat and neutralizing it are two different things. Think about it this way. The Allies spent billions on intelligence gathering, spy networks, aerial reconnaissance, code breaking, and then the Germans, through the simple act of locking up the wrong people in the wrong place, handed the Allies a secondary intelligence stream that cost nothing but the courage of men willing to crawl through tunnels and across frozen mountains to get home. Every officer who made it back to Allied lines was debriefed for days. What did you see? How many guards? What were their routines? What documents did they use? What were the weak points in the fence, the gaps in the patrols, the moments when the system slipped? This wasn't just about personal freedom. It was about weaponizing the experience of captivity itself. And that brings us to the camps that became battlegrounds in their own right. There's a tendency to think of prison escapes as spontaneous, born from desperation, executed on instinct, a moment of inattention from a guard, a lucky break, a mad dash for the wire. The escapes that mattered in World War II were nothing like that. They were planned operations, some lasting months or even years. They required specialization, engineers to design and shore up tunnels, forgers to replicate German paperwork, tailors to convert blankets into civilian clothing, intelligence officers to map guard rotations and identify blind spots, and leaders to coordinate hundreds of prisoners without tipping off informants. In essence, the camps developed internal economies underground, literally and figuratively, dedicated entirely to the logistics of escape. Take Colditz Castle. On paper, it was the ultimate escape-proof facility, a medieval fortress perched on a cliff, thick walls, limited access points, extra guards. The Germans used it as a dumping ground for incorrigibles, officers who had already escaped from other camps and been recaptured. The logic was simple. Put all the troublemakers in one maximum security site and let them rot. The flaw in that logic? You just put every escape-obsessed brain in one place. Every man who'd already proven he could think his way out of a supposedly secure camp. Every engineer, forger, and tactician who'd made escape his full-time occupation. So let's pause on that for a second. If you take every officer who has made escape his full-time hobby and lock them together in a medieval maze full of blind spots and hidden passages, what exactly did you think was going to happen? Colditz became an escape factory. Not metaphorically, literally. Different departments emerged. A forgery section producing German passes and civilian identification papers, a tailoring section converting uniforms, an engineering section constructing tools from scavenged metal and bed slats, and an intelligence section tracking guard behavior and gathering information on the outside world. And that's just one camp. At Stalag Luft III, Allied airmen dug 3 massive tunnels simultaneously, Tom, Dick, and Harry, complete with electric lighting, air pumps, and trolley systems to move earth. The engineering involved rivals any civilian construction project, except it was done entirely in secret, under the noses of guards specifically trained to detect tunneling. In occupied Norway, the escape looked different. No walls, no wire, but an entire country turned into the hunting ground. A single operative, cut off from his mission and hunted by the Gestapo, had to navigate across hundreds of miles of Arctic terrain with no map, no supplies, and no certainty that the people he encountered wouldn't turn him in for the bounty on his head. What linked all of these cases, Colditz's industrial escape operation, Stalag Luft III's subterranean engineering, the lone operative in the snow, was this: the escape itself was only the beginning. The real value came from what happened after, what intelligence was carried out, what morale was lifted, what cracks in the Nazi security apparatus were exposed for the Allies to exploit. Here's the umbrella promise for what's coming. These aren't just great escapes in the romantic sense, daring men, desperate odds, cinematic moments. They're covert operations that forced the Nazi state to waste time, manpower, and psychological energy on prisoners who refused to stay put. They turned containment into a resource drain. They turned prison camps into parallel fronts. And the men who pulled them off, some became legends, some were executed within days of recapture, and some disappeared so completely into the war effort that their names were classified for decades. Let's start with the castle, where escape became an industry. Colditz Castle rises from a cliff overlooking the Mulde River in Saxony, a Renaissance fortress that looks lifted from a medieval painting. Thick stone walls, narrow windows, towers that command a view of every approach. It is, by any architectural standard, imposing. By 1940, the Germans had decided it was the perfect place to put the prisoners they couldn't handle anywhere else. The official designation was O-Flag 4C, a high security camp for officers who had proven themselves chronic escape risks. If you'd broken out of another camp and been recaptured, Colditz was where you went. If you'd caused enough trouble elsewhere that the commandant wanted you gone, Colditz was the dumping ground. The British, French, Polish, Dutch, and Belgian officers sent there all shared one trait. They had refused to accept captivity as the end of their war. The German logic was sound on paper. These men are too dangerous to keep in standard camps, so we isolate them in a single, heavily fortified location, far from any border, crawling with guards, and wait for them to realize escape is impossible. But here's the thing. No one on the German planning staff seemed to consider. When you concentrate every officer who has already demonstrated ingenuity, persistence, and a refusal to quit in one location, you don't neutralize the threat. You create a think tank. Colditz had roughly 500 prisoners at any given time during the war. The guard contingent was over 200, nearly one guard for every 2 prisoners, an extraordinary ratio for a POW camp. There were regular searches, roll calls 5 times a day, and random inspections designed to catch contraband. The prisoners were watched constantly, and yet, between 1940 and 1945, over 30 men successfully escaped from Colditz. Some reached neutral territory. Some made it back to Allied lines. Others were recaptured miles from freedom. But the attempts themselves, there were more than 300 documented efforts, became a form of resistance. The escapes weren't just about who got out. They were about forcing the Germans to treat the castle as an active security problem, draining resources and attention that could have been used elsewhere. And inside those stone walls, something remarkable happened. The prisoners didn't just try to escape. They systematized it. To understand Colditz, you have to stop thinking of it as a prison and start thinking of it as a covert workshop operating under enemy observation. The prisoners built an internal economy around escape. And like any economy, it had specialization. There was the forgery department, run primarily by British and Polish officers who had experience in document work. They produced German travel passes, identity papers, and even official stamps using carved soap, ink made from boot polish and crushed pills, and paper pilfered from Red Cross parcels. Every piece had to be pixel perfect. A single smudged letter or incorrect date format would mean arrest within hours of reaching a checkpoint. Ask yourself, how long could you study a German railway pass under your bunk with a smuggled flashlight before you could replicate every serif, every spacing error, every bureaucratic quirk that makes the document feel real? Days? Weeks? These men worked on single documents for months, aging them with tea and dirt so they didn't look freshly printed. Then there was the tailoring section. Prisoners converted their uniforms into approximations of civilian clothing or German military attire. They dyed uniforms gray or brown using whatever they could scavenge. boot polish, ink, coffee grounds. They sewed hidden pockets into coats to conceal maps and compasses. Some even constructed Wehrmacht uniforms accurate enough to pass a cursory inspection in low light. The engineering section operated on a different scale. They carved tools from bed frames and scrap metal. They constructed rope from bed sheets, braided tightly enough to hold a man's weight. They dismantled and reassembled furniture to create false bottoms in lockers and walls. They mapped the entire castle, every blind corner, every gap in the guard patrols, every ventilation shaft, and unused attic. And then there was the most audacious project Colditz ever attempted, the glider. Yes, a glider. Two prisoners, Bill Goldfinch and Jack Bess, both RAF officers, decided that since the castle sat on a cliff and tunneling was nearly impossible due to the rock foundation, the only logical escape route was up. They built a two-man glider in a sealed attic space above the chapel, using bed slats for the frame, sleeping bag fabric for the wings, and millet from Red Cross parcels to make glue. They calculated launch speeds, wing angles, and weight distribution using stolen German engineering manuals and scraps of paper covered in hand-drawn aerodynamic equations. Let that sit for a second. You're standing in a drafty attic, holding a piece of a homemade glider wing carved from bed slats, knowing that if this works, you vanish into the clouds. And if it fails, you die within sight of the freedom you've been planning for years. The glider was never used. The war ended before the prisoners could launch it, but the fact that it existed, that it was functional according to post-war tests, tells you everything about the mindset inside Colditz. These men did not accept the walls, and every successful escape reinforced that mindset. Pat Reed, a British officer, escaped in 1942 by hiding in a group of French officers being transferred out of the castle. He walked out the front gate in a French uniform, then made his way through occupied territory to Switzerland. Harry Neve, who would later become a member of Parliament, escaped dressed as a German officer, complete with forged papers and a homemade iron cross. He walked out during a shift change, caught a train, and reached Switzerland within days. The French officer, Alain Leray, escaped by scaling the outer wall in broad daylight using a homemade grappling hook, then hiking through the countryside to reach the Swiss border. Each escape was different. Each exploited a different flaw in the system, and each one taught the prisoners and the Germans a little more about where the fortress wasn't as impregnable as it looked. At what point does it stop being a duty to escape and start being suicide dressed up as courage? That's the question that hung over every tunnel dug, every wall scaled, every document forged. The Geneva Convention required officers to attempt escape if possible, but nowhere did it define the line between a calculated risk and a death wish. Some prisoners thought the glider crossed that line. Others thought it was brilliant. The camp split along philosophical lines: those who believed any escape was worth attempting, and those who believed reckless attempts only made life harder for everyone by triggering collective punishments. That tension never fully resolved. Here's what the successful escapees brought back. First, intelligence. Every officer who reached Allied lines was debriefed extensively. They provided detailed information on the internal layout of German POW camps, guard routines, interrogation techniques, and the locations and capacities of other camps they'd passed through or heard about. This wasn't trivial data. It helped the Allies understand how the German military treated prisoners, which camps were well supplied, which were brutal, and which had exploitable security gaps. Colditz escapees also brought back information about occupied Europe itself. They had traveled through Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and into neutral Switzerland. They noted troop movements, bombed out rail lines, German morale, the attitudes of civilians, and the effectiveness of Allied bombing campaigns. They were, in essence, mobile reconnaissance units. Second, propaganda value. The British press celebrated Colditz escapes. So did the BBC. The message was clear. Even in Hitler's most secure prison, British officers refused to be beaten. The stories boosted morale at home and among Allied troops. They also humiliated the German High Command, which had publicly touted Colditz as escape-proof. From a purely psychological standpoint, that mattered. The Nazi regime built its image on control, efficiency, and invincibility. Every escape was a crack in that image. Third, resource drain. The Germans responded to Colditz escapes by reinforcing security. More guards, more searches, more roll calls, more surveillance. Every additional guard at Colditz was one fewer guard available for frontline duty or other strategic tasks. The camp became a resource sink, a fortress that required constant vigilance simply to hold a few hundred prisoners who, in theory, we were already neutralized. Let's frame this differently. Every officer who made it over that wall carried out more than their own skin. They brought back blueprints of the German prison system, where it cracked, where it held, and how hard the enemy had to work just to keep their captives from walking back into the war. But Colditz was, in many ways, an outlier. It was a contained space, a single fortress, a known quantity. What happens when the prison isn't a castle with walls, but an entire country? What happens when one man, alone and hunted, has to survive not behind wire, but across hundreds of miles of frozen terrain, relying on strangers who have every reason to turn him in and almost no reason to help? That's where we go next. March 1943, the Norwegian coast. A fishing boat cuts through dark water under a moonless sky, carrying a team of Norwegian commandos trained in Britain and sent back to their occupied homeland on a sabotage mission. The target, German installations near Trondheim. The goal, disrupt Nazi operations and bolster local resistance. The mission goes wrong almost immediately. The boat is spotted. German patrol vessels close in. A firefight erupts. Most of the team is killed. The rest are captured and executed within hours. Standard procedure for commandos under Hitler's notorious commando order, which decreed that Special Forces operatives were to be shot on sight. No trial, no prisoner of war protections. But one man escapes the initial ambush. His name is Jan Baalsrud, and he is about to become the most hunted man in northern Norway. Baalsrud plunges into the freezing water and swims to shore. He's already wounded. Gunfire grazed his foot. But he makes it to the rocks, collapses behind cover, and realizes the scope of his situation. He's alone. No backup. No extraction plan. No working radio. The Gestapo and Wehrmacht are mobilizing every available unit to find him because they know what he is. A trained saboteur with knowledge of Allied operations, contact networks, and resistance structures. Letting him slip away is not an option. And he's in the Arctic in March, with temperatures well below freezing and terrain that can kill even experienced outdoorsmen. Be honest with yourself. If you were freezing, wounded, and alone in enemy territory, how long before you decide the smart move was to surrender and hope they treat you as a normal POW? What if you knew they'd already executed your entire team? What if you knew that the moment they confirm your identity, you're dead? Baalsrud doesn't surrender. He runs. For the next 2 months, Jan Baalsrud will cross more than 150 miles of Arctic wilderness, much of it on foot, some of it barely conscious. He will suffer severe frostbite, lose several toes to gangrene, endure snow blindness, and at one point spend days buried in a snowdrift waiting for rescuers who may never come. But he doesn't do it alone. And that's the part of this story that matters beyond the individual act of survival. Because at every step, he is helped by people who owe him nothing and risk everything by sheltering him. The first contact is a pair of fishermen who find him shivering on the shore, barely able to speak. They recognize him as one of the commandos, or at least they recognize that the Germans are hunting him. They could turn him in. The reward is substantial. The alternative is execution if they're caught harboring him. They hide him in a fishing shed, bring him food, and send word through quiet channels to the local resistance. From there, Baalsrud is passed from house to house, barn to barn, along an improvised network that stretches across the northern coast. No one person knows the full route. Each link in the chain knows only the next step, protecting the network in case anyone is captured and interrogated. A family hides him in their attic for days, knowing that German patrols are searching every building within 10 miles. They feed him from their own rations, which are already meager under occupation. When he develops a fever, they bring a doctor, who also risks death by treating a fugitive. Here's the moral hinge. How many strangers would you risk your family for because someone whispered, "He's one of ours and the enemy is hunting him"? 1? 2? A dozen over weeks? The people who helped Jan Baalsrud made that calculation over and over, and most of them were not resistance fighters. They were farmers, fishermen, shopkeepers, people who had no combat training, no intelligence background, no way to defend themselves if the Gestapo kicked in their door. They helped because it was the right thing to do. And because letting one man slip through the German net, any man, was a small act of defiance that mattered. At one point, Baalsrud is too weak to walk. His frostbite has turned to gangrene. He's delirious from fever. The resistance decides the only option is to move him by sled across a mountain plateau to reach the Swedish border where he can be evacuated. It takes a team of resistance fighters and local volunteers days to drag the sled through snow and ice, dodging German patrols and enduring brutal weather. Some of them will later be arrested. Some will be sent to concentration camps. Some will survive the war. Some won't. But they get him across. Jan Baalsrud reaches Sweden in May 1943, 2 months after the mission collapsed. He's missing toes, half blind, and so emaciated that the Swedish authorities barely recognize him as human, but he's alive. And that fact, by itself, is a strategic win. Here's why. From Berlin's point of view, Baalsrud is just one man who slipped the net. A statistical anomaly. Not worth the resources it would take to keep hunting him once he's across the border. From the Allied point of view, he's something else entirely. He's debriefed for weeks. British intelligence wants to know everything. The German response times to the initial raid, the patrol patterns along the coast, the behavior of local informants, the capacity and willingness of the Norwegian resistance to shelter operatives, the terrain and weather conditions, and the psychological impact of the commando order on captured personnel. Every detail Baalsrud provides gets folded into Allied planning. Future missions are adjusted based on what he learned. Coastal defenses are mapped. Resistance networks are reinforced. But the real value isn't just the intelligence. It's the story. Within weeks, Jan Baalsrud's escape is circulating through occupied Norway, passed along in whispers, in coded messages, in underground newspapers. The details morph and grow, some accurate, some exaggerated. But the core narrative remains the same. A Norwegian commando was hunted by the entire German occupation apparatus, and he got away. That story matters because it says in the quietest but most dangerous way possible that the Germans don't have total control, that the net has holes, that people are willing to help, even at the cost of their own lives. From Berlin's perspective, one escaped operative is an embarrassment. From the Norwegian resistance perspective, it's proof that the occupation can be resisted. It's fuel for morale. It's a spark for thousands of quiet conversations in occupied towns that start with 3 dangerous words. They didn't catch him. And for the Allies, it's a blueprint. If Baalsrud could survive 2 months in the Arctic with help from civilians, then future missions could be designed with that network in mind. Safe houses could be prearranged. Routes could be planned. The invisible web of resistance that kept him alive could be formalized and expanded. Here's the ripple effect no one planned for. The Germans respond by tightening control, increasing patrols, and punishing suspected collaborators, which alienates more civilians, which pushes more people toward the resistance, which makes future escapes slightly easier and future operations slightly more viable. One man's survival becomes a pressure point on the entire occupation. But individual escapes, one man in the snow, one officer over a castle wall, have limited scale. They're dramatic. They're inspiring. They prove that the system isn't perfect. What happens when hundreds of men decide to dig under a camp built specifically to hold the best trained prisoners the Germans ever captured? What happens when the escape isn't one man's gamble, but an industrial operation involving dozens of engineers, forgers, and tacticians working in secret for over a year? That's the next act. If you've heard of one World War II escape, it's probably this one. The Great Escape. Steve McQueen on a motorcycle, a rousing musical theme, a sanitized, heroic narrative where the good guys tunnel out, the bad guys chase them, and everyone who dies does so cleanly, off camera, with honor intact. The movie is excellent entertainment. It's also a lie by omission. The truth is more technical, more disciplined, and in the end, far more disturbing than the credits ever admitted. It's a story about engineering brilliance and bureaucratic murder, about men who built something extraordinary underground and were executed for it, about a breakout that succeeded in ways the planners never intended and failed in ways that haunt the historical record. Let's be clear from the start. You've seen the movie, motorbikes, barbed wire, a catchy theme. The truth is more technical, more disciplined, and, in the end, far more disturbing than the credits ever admitted. Stalag Luft III was a camp for captured Allied aircrew located in occupied Poland near the town of Sagan, deep in German territory. It was built specifically to hold pilots and navigators, men with valuable technical knowledge, high education, and a track record of escape attempts from other camps. The Germans designed it with every known anti-escape measure in mind. The huts were raised on stilts so guards could see underneath, eliminating the possibility of concealed tunneling. The sandy soil was deliberately chosen because it's unstable. Collapses are common, and the bright yellow color makes it nearly impossible to hide excavated dirt. The perimeter had double fences with coiled wire, watchtowers every 100 meters, seismograph microphones buried underground to detect tunneling vibrations, and regular patrols with guard dogs. It was, by every metric available in 1943, escape-proof. The prisoners responded by digging 3 of the most sophisticated tunnels in the history of prison escapes. Let's talk about what sophisticated actually means in this context. The prisoners designated 3 tunnels: Tom, Dick, and Harry. Each was over 300 feet long, roughly 30 feet underground, and narrow enough that a man could barely crawl through on his elbows and knees. Each required months of work, conducted entirely in secret, with hundreds of prisoners involved in some capacity. First problem: how do you dig 300 feet of tunnel in sand without it collapsing on you? Answer: you shore it up. The prisoners dismantled over 4,000 bed slats, sleeping on sagging mattresses and broken frames for months, and used them to build wooden frames every few feet along the tunnel walls and ceiling. They scavenged nails, carved joints, and fitted the boards together with the precision of professional carpenters. The result was a tunnel that could withstand the weight of the earth above it, Barely. Cave-ins still happened. Men were buried and had to be dug out by hand in pitch darkness, often unconscious, sometimes not breathing. You crawl forward in the dark, elbows and knees, knowing a single cave-in can bury you alive, and a single careless noise can bring a guard's boot straight down on the thin skin of earth above your head. How far would you crawl before you decided the next meter wasn't worth the risk? Second problem, air. At 300 feet, the oxygen runs out fast. Men working at the tunnel face, digging, shoring, hauling dirt, were passing out from hypoxia. Answer, build an air pump. The prisoners constructed a bellows system from kit bags and scavenged metal with a hand crank and a pipeline made from powdered milk tins soldered together. One man sat at the tunnel entrance for hours, pumping air through a 300-foot pipeline so the diggers at the far end could breathe. Third problem, how do you move hundreds of pounds of dirt out of a tunnel every day without being seen? Answer, you build a trolley system. The prisoners laid wooden rails along the tunnel floor and constructed carts from wood and scrap metal. One man rode the cart to the tunnel face, loaded it with dirt, then signaled by pulling a rope. Another man hauled it back to the entrance using a pulley system. The whole operation ran like an underground railway. Fourth problem, what do you do with all that bright yellow sand once you've dug it out? Answer, you hide it. The prisoners built pouches inside their trousers, filled them with sand, and walked casually around the camp, releasing the sand in small amounts onto the topsoil where it mixed with the darker dirt and disappeared. Hundreds of men every day walking slow circles, dispersing tons of sand one handful at a time. And fifth problem, how do you light a tunnel 300 feet long with no electricity? Answer, you steal it. The prisoners tapped into the camp's electrical system, running concealed wiring into the tunnels. They built lamps from tin cans and stolen bulbs, creating just enough light to see by without overloading the circuit and triggering an investigation. This wasn't a prison break. This was a covert engineering project. And above ground, while the tunnels were being dug, other prisoners ran parallel operations. The forgery department produced over 200 fake identity documents, travel permits, and railway passes. They replicated German typewriter fonts by carving individual letters from linoleum and building a makeshift printing press. They made ink from boot polish, paper from Red Cross parcel packaging, and stamps by carving soap. The tailoring department converted RAF uniforms into civilian suits and German military uniforms. They dyed fabric using coffee, beet juice, and ink. They sewed hidden pockets to conceal maps and compasses. The intelligence section tracked guard movements, compiled schedules, and identified blind spots in the perimeter patrols. They bribed guards for information, monitored German radio broadcasts, and maintained a detailed map of the rail network beyond the camp. And all of this, every piece, every operation, was coordinated by a central escape committee that functioned like a military staff, with specialization, rank structure, and operational security. The Germans knew something was happening. They conducted random searches. They interrogated prisoners. They planted informants. But the scale of the operation was so large, and so many prisoners were involved, that no single search ever uncovered the full picture. By early 1944, Harry was ready. The night of March 24th, 1944 was cold and moonless. Perfect for an escape, except for one problem. The tunnel exit, which was supposed to emerge in the cover of trees just beyond the wire, came up short. It broke the surface 10 feet shy of the tree line in open ground visible from the nearest watchtower. The prisoners had miscalculated. They were exposed. They went anyway. The plan called for 200 men to escape that night. In reality, 76 made it out before a guard noticed movement near the tunnel exit and raised the alarm. What happened next is well documented, but still shocking to read. The Gestapo mobilized a massive manhunt. Every train station checkpoint and border crossing in occupied Europe was put on alert. Thousands of soldiers, police officers, and Gestapo agents were diverted from other duties to hunt for escaped prisoners. Within days, most of the escapees were recaptured. A few made it back to Allied lines. Most did not. And then came the reprisal. On Hitler's direct order, the Gestapo executed 50 of the recaptured officers, not in combat, not while resisting arrest. They were taken to remote locations in small groups, told to stretch their legs by the side of the road, and shot in the back of the head. Their bodies were cremated. Their ashes were returned to the camp in urns with falsified death certificates claiming they were shot while attempting to escape. A bureaucratic lie that fooled no one. The murders were a war crime. They violated the Geneva Convention. They violated even Germany's own military code. And they sent a clear message. Escape is no longer just risky. It's a death sentence. The prisoners at Stalag Luft III, the ones who stayed behind, learned about the murders slowly. First a few names, then more, then the full list. 50 men who had done nothing more than try to get home. The psychological impact was immediate and complex. Some prisoners were enraged. Some were paralyzed by grief. Some stopped planning escapes altogether, deciding the cost was too high. Others doubled down, viewing the murders as proof that resistance mattered, that the Germans were scared enough to break their own rules. If 76 men go out through a tunnel and only a handful make it home, was it worth it? From a strategic perspective, the answer might be yes. The breakout forced the Germans to divert significant resources, men, vehicles, communication networks, away from the front lines to hunt for prisoners. It exposed weaknesses in the German railway system, checkpoint procedures, and internal security protocols. The few officers who made it back to Britain were debriefed extensively, providing detailed intelligence on German interrogation methods, camp layouts, occupied territory conditions, and the psychological state of German forces in 1944. From a propaganda perspective, absolutely. The escape dominated headlines across the Allied world. It demonstrated that even in the heart of occupied Poland, Allied prisoners refused to give up. The subsequent murders, once they became public knowledge, turned into a propaganda disaster for Germany. Proof of Nazi brutality that was used in everything from recruitment campaigns to war crimes tribunals. But from the families of the 50 executed men, from the perspective of the pilots and navigators who were shot in the back of the head for trying to go home, the ledger looks very different. And that's the tension the historical record can't resolve. Both things are true. The escape had strategic value, and 50 men were murdered for it. Let's sit with that discomfort for a moment, because it's the discomfort at the heart of every covert operation, every calculated risk, every decision to send people into danger for objectives that sound clean on a briefing paper, but cost actual lives in actual moments. Every extra meter of tunnel increased your chance of success and your odds of dying in a collapse. Every additional escapee multiplied the chaos you caused and the reprisals you invited. Where would you stop digging? Where would you say, this is far enough? The risk now outweighs the gain. The prisoners at Stalag Luft III never got to make that calculation from a position of safety. They made it in the dark, in the tunnel, with incomplete information and no guarantee that their sacrifice would mean anything. Some of them are remembered. Roger Bushell, the mastermind behind the escape, shot by the Gestapo. Tom Kirby Green, gunned down on a country road. 50 names that appear on memorials and in history books. The other 26 who got out and were recaptured, but not executed. They're footnotes. The ones who stayed behind and pumped air, forged documents, disposed of dirt, covered for the diggers during roll call, they're barely mentioned at all. That's the uncomfortable reality of how history remembers escapes. The dramatic exit matters. The infrastructure that made it possible gets edited out, and the people who paid the highest price are reduced to a number, 50. If you're feeling that tension, if you can't file this under a neat answer of heroic or wasteful, don't switch off. Because the last act is about what these stories do to us now. Who we choose to remember, who we choose to call hero, and who we call troublemaker. And why that choice still matters when we look at people today who take risks to expose uncomfortable truths about systems we trust. Let's zoom out and ask the coldest question possible. What did these escapes actually accomplish in military terms? Start with the raw intelligence. Every prisoner who made it back to Allied lines, whether from Colditz, from the Arctic, from Stalag Luft III, or from any of the dozens of other camps across occupied Europe, underwent extensive debriefing. British intelligence service handlers wanted to know everything. Not just how the escape happened, but everything the escapee had observed: camp layouts, guard strengths and rotations, interrogation techniques, morale among German personnel, conditions in occupied territories, effectiveness of Allied bombing campaigns on infrastructure, civilian attitudes toward the occupation, which documents were required at which checkpoints, how thoroughly those documents were inspected, and which types of forged papers passed inspection versus which raised flags. This wasn't casual conversation. These were structured intelligence gathering sessions that lasted days or sometimes weeks. Every detail was recorded, analyzed, and cross-referenced with information from other sources, and it added up. Take the intelligence gathered from Stalag Luft III escapees. The prisoners who made it back provided detailed maps of the rail network in occupied Poland and eastern Germany, information on troop movements they'd observed during recapture, and accounts of how different German units responded to the manhunt. They described which civilian populations were sympathetic to Allied prisoners, which areas had active resistance networks, and which border crossings had the lightest security. That information fed directly into Allied planning for future operations, everything from bomber routes to the logistics of supporting resistance movements. From Colditz escapees, the Allies learned about the vulnerabilities in the German POW camp system, which camps had exploitable layouts, which guard units were understaffed or poorly trained, and which commandants were willing to look the other way on minor infractions in exchange for a quiet camp. They also gathered intelligence on the treatment of prisoners, which helped the Allies understand Nazi compliance with, or violation of, the Geneva Convention. From escapes like Jan Baalsrud's, the Allies gained insight into the capacity and structure of underground resistance networks in occupied countries, which safe houses were reliable, which routes were compromised, which civilians could be trusted, which areas had active Gestapo surveillance. Here's the reframe. We treat these men as lone wolves in barbed wire epics. In reality, the moment they got out, they became something colder and more useful. Data points in a war room, proof that the enemy's secure system leaked in very specific places. And the Germans knew it. That's why the response to major escapes was so disproportionate. That's why Hitler personally ordered the execution of 50 men after Stalag Luft III. It wasn't just punishment. It was an attempt to reset the cost-benefit equation, to make escape so dangerous that even officers who felt duty-bound to attempt it would hesitate. But the intelligence value was only part of the equation. The psychological and propaganda impact was equally significant, perhaps more so. Every successful escape was a story, and stories in wartime are weapons. The British press covered Colditz escapes extensively. The BBC broadcast accounts of daring breakouts, interviews with returned officers, and tributes to those who'd been recaptured or killed. The message to the British public was clear. even behind enemy lines. Even in the most secure Nazi prisons, British officers are still fighting. And that mattered for morale at a time when the war news was often grim. It also mattered for recruitment. Young men considering whether to volunteer for dangerous roles, bomber crews, commando units, intelligence operations, saw these stories and understood that even if they were captured, the fight didn't end. Captivity was just another battlefield. And it mattered for the prisoners themselves. Every camp across the German system heard about the Colditz escapes, the Stalag Luft III tunnel, the Norwegian commando who walked out of the Arctic. Those stories circulated through underground channels, whispered during exercise periods, coded into letters home. The message: we are not forgotten, we are not abandoned, and the system is not unbeatable. From the German perspective, every escape was a humiliation. The Nazi regime built its entire identity on control, order, and the inevitability of German victory. Every prisoner who walked out of a secure camp was a crack in that narrative. The Germans responded by tightening security, more guards, more roll calls, more punishments, more resources devoted to preventing the next breakout, which is exactly what the Allies wanted. Every guard posted at a POW camp was a guard not available for frontline combat. Every Gestapo agent hunting escaped prisoners was an agent not hunting resistance cells. Every security protocol added to the camp system was friction, inefficiency, paranoia, all the things that slowly grind down a totalitarian state from the inside. Think about the strategic feedback loop. Prisoners escape. Germans tighten security, which makes conditions harsher, which motivates more escape attempts, which forces even tighter security, which drains even more resources. The camps stop being static holding pens and become active resource sinks. And then there's the post-war impact. After 1945, many of the intelligence networks and resistance contacts established during these escapes became the foundation for post-war intelligence operations. The people who hid Jan Baalsrud went on to work with Allied intelligence agencies. The forgers at Colditz found themselves recruited into counter-espionage roles. The engineering knowledge developed in the tunnels of Stalag Luft III informed post-war security protocols and prison design. The escapes didn't just affect the war, they shaped what came after. But here's where the story gets uncomfortable in a different way. There's a pattern in how these stories get told, and it's worth examining. During the war, many of the men who attempted escapes were not treated as heroes by their own side. They were problems, troublemakers, guys who made life harder for everyone else by provoking German reprisals, disrupting camp routines, and drawing unwanted attention. Some senior officers in POW camps actively discouraged escape attempts, arguing that they caused collective punishments, reduced rations, canceled privileges, harsher discipline that hurt everyone. They saw it as selfishness dressed up as duty. After the war, that narrative flipped. The troublemakers became heroes. The men who'd been court-martialed for unauthorized escape attempts were given medals. The same escapes that camp commanders had called reckless were now celebrated as daring. Why the shift? Because in hindsight, we could see the strategic value. We could count the intelligence gained, measure the propaganda impact, calculate the resources drained. We could fit the escapes into a coherent narrative about resistance and defiance. But during the actual events, none of that was clear. During the events, escape attempts often felt like chaos, like individual egos overriding collective welfare, like unnecessary risk that made everyone else's captivity more brutal. Here's the uncomfortable parallel. When someone in your own time points at a dangerous flaw inside a system you trust, a whistleblower, an investigative journalist, an insider who leaks documents showing malfeasance, how do you respond? Do you see them as someone trying to expose a problem that needs fixing? Or do you see them as a traitor, a troublemaker? Someone making your life harder by disrupting a system that was working fine until they stuck their nose in. It's easy now to clap for the man who crawled through a tunnel in 1944. Harder question. When someone in your own time points at a dangerous failure inside a system you trust, do you see an escapee or a traitor? The historical record is full of examples of people who were vilified in their own time and vindicated later. Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, Chelsea Manning and the Iraq War Logs, Edward Snowden and mass surveillance. The pattern repeats. Someone inside a system sees something wrong, exposes it, and gets destroyed for it. Prosecuted, exiled, imprisoned, character assassinated. And then, years later, the narrative shifts. Historians look back and say, actually, they were right. The system was doing what they said it was doing. The public did have a right to know. But by then, the person who exposed it has already paid the price. Drop one case in the comments, historical or modern, where someone took a risk to expose a flaw or a crime and paid for it instead of being thanked. Put them on the record here. This isn't a perfect analogy. Escaping from a POW camp is not the same as leaking classified documents. The contexts are different. The stakes are different. The legal frameworks are different. But the psychological mechanism is the same. We are wired to distrust people who break the rules of systems we depend on, even when those systems are broken. We call them disruptive, self-serving, naive, reckless. And later, when the full picture comes into focus, we call them brave. The question is, can we close that gap? Can we learn to recognize people who are pointing at genuine problems before history forces us to admit they were right? Because the uncomfortable truth is that the prisoners at Colditz, Stalag Luft III, and across occupied Europe were not universally supported. Many were criticized by their fellow prisoners for making life harder. Many were doubted by their own command when they made it back, questioned about whether they'd collaborated, whether they'd given up intelligence under interrogation, whether their escapes had been worth the cost. It took years, sometimes decades, for the full value of what they did to become clear. And in the meantime, they lived with the knowledge that they'd been called troublemakers by the people they were trying to help. Let's talk about the people who don't appear in the escape narratives. For every officer who made it out of Colditz, there were dozens who didn't, who dug tunnels that collapsed, who climbed walls and fell, who made it over the wire only to be recaptured within hours. Some were sent to punishment camps. Some were executed. Some disappeared into the Nazi camp system and were never heard from again. For every man like Jan Baalsrud who survived the Arctic crossing, there were others who didn't. Commandos captured and shot, resistance members executed for harboring fugitives, civilians sent to concentration camps for offering a meal or a place to hide. For every successful escapee from Stalag Luft III, there were the 50 who were murdered as reprisal. And for every one of those 50, there were families who spent the rest of their lives wondering if the escape had been worth their son's life, their husband's life, their father's life. The cost gets left out of the heroic narrative. Not because historians are dishonest, but because it's easier to tell a story about success than to dwell on the grinding cumulative price paid by people whose names we don't even know. Here's an example most people have never heard of. At Colditz, one of the escape attempts involved a tunnel dug from the camp chapel. It took months. It was nearly complete. And then a guard discovered it during a random inspection. The prisoners who'd worked on it were sent to solitary confinement. The entire camp was punished with reduced rations and canceled privileges for weeks. Morale plummeted. Several prisoners suffered mental breakdowns. One attempted suicide. That tunnel never made it into the popular history of Colditz because it didn't succeed. The men who dug it aren't celebrated. The cost they paid, physical, psychological, doesn't fit the narrative of daring escape and triumphant return. Multiply that by hundreds of failed attempts across dozens of camps, and you start to see the hidden toll. The Norwegian civilians who hid Jan Baalsrud risked not just their own lives, but their families. If the Gestapo discovered them, the punishment was deportation to concentration camps or immediate execution. And unlike Baalsrud, these civilians had no training, no operational support, no extraction plan. They were just people doing the right thing in the worst possible circumstances. Some of them were caught, some were executed, some survived but lost family members, and most of them are not remembered by name because they weren't the ones being hunted. They were the ones doing the hiding. At what point do we acknowledge that the success of an escape often depended on people who got no recognition and bore the highest cost? The prisoners who stayed behind at Stalag Luft III and continued covering for the escape committee, even knowing that the Gestapo was investigating. The forgers who kept producing documents even after friends were executed. The civilians who continued sheltering fugitives even after neighbors disappeared for doing the same. These people don't get movies made about them. And that's not necessarily wrong. Storytelling requires focus, and heroes need to be identifiable, and narratives need arcs. But it does mean we're always getting an incomplete picture. We're seeing the climactic moment, the tunnel exit, the border crossing, the triumphant return, without fully accounting for the infrastructure of courage that made that moment possible. And we're definitely not counting the failures, the collapses, the attempts that went nowhere except into solitary confinement or a shallow grave. If you feel that tension, if you can't resolve it into a clean moral, that's appropriate, because the people who lived through it couldn't resolve it either. So what do we do with these stories? First, we tell them accurately, not sanitized, not simplified into tales of good guys and bad guys where everyone makes the right choice and the costs are always worth it. We tell them with the full weight of what they meant, the intelligence gained and the lives lost, the strategic victories and the personal devastations, the heroes celebrated and the troublemakers vilified, the successes trumpeted and the failures buried. Second, we recognize patterns. The same psychological dynamics that turned escapees into problems before turning them into heroes are still operating today. We still distrust people who break the rules of systems we depend on. We still call them naive, reckless, self-serving, until history proves them right, at which point we call them brave. Can we learn to shorten that lag? Can we get better at recognizing when someone is pointing at a genuine flaw versus just causing chaos? Can we build systems that reward truth-telling instead of punishing it? Third, we remember the infrastructure. Every escape that succeeded had a support network: forgers, engineers, lookouts, civilians, resistance members, people who risked everything to move one person closer to freedom. And most of those people are not remembered by name. So when you hear a story about someone who single-handedly did something extraordinary, ask, who else was involved? Who provided the tools, the cover, the safe house, the forged papers, the intelligence? Who paid the price when it went wrong? Because the myth of the lone hero is almost always a lie, and believing it makes us undervalue the collaborative, unglamorous, dangerous work that actually changes things. Fourth, we sit with the discomfort. Some of these escapes were worth it, some weren't. Some saved lives and shortened the war. Some accomplished nothing except getting good men killed. And we will never have enough information to judge definitively because war is chaos and outcomes are contingent. And the people who made the decisions did so with incomplete information under unbearable pressure. So we sit with the discomfort instead of rushing to judgment. And fifth, this is the hardest one, we apply the same lens to the present. When someone today risks their career, their freedom, their safety to expose a flaw in a system we trust, we have a choice. Dismiss them as a troublemaker, or consider the possibility that they're seeing something we've chosen not to see. When someone leaks documents showing that a government program violates civil liberties, we can call them a traitor, or we can ask whether the program should have been secret in the first place. When someone inside a corporation exposes fraud or negligence, we can call them disloyal, or we can ask why the internal mechanisms for reporting problems failed so badly that leaking became the only option. When someone in the military reports war crimes, we can call them weak, or we can ask why the command structure made it impossible to report those crimes through official channels. These are not easy questions, and the answers are almost never clean. But if we've learned anything from the escapes of World War II, it's this. The people who refuse to accept the walls are often the ones who force the rest of us to see that the walls were never as solid as we thought. We started with a simple question. What happens when people who are not supposed to get out do? We walked the corridors of Colditz, where escape became an industry. Forgers and engineers and tailors working in secret to punch holes in a fortress designed to be impregnable. We followed a hunted man across Arctic snow, kept alive by strangers who refused to look away even when looking away would have been safer, easier, saner. We crawled through sand at Stalag Luft III, where engineering genius met murderous reprisal, where 76 men went into the night and 50 were executed for trying to go home. And we watched how every successful breakout punched a small, permanent hole in the story the Nazi state told itself about control. These weren't just escapes. They were operations, covert missions conducted behind wire by men who refused to accept that capture meant the end of their war. Some of them became legends. Some were executed within hours of recapture, and some disappeared so completely into the classified machinery of intelligence work that their names stayed secret for decades. But all of them, successful or failed, celebrated or forgotten, alive or dead, changed the war in ways that extended far beyond the wire. They forced the Germans to divert resources, tighten security, waste manpower on guarding prisoners who were supposed to be contained. They brought back intelligence that fed into Allied planning. They provided propaganda that boosted morale and humiliated the enemy, and they proved over and over that totalitarian control is an illusion that cracks under pressure. The question now is, what do we do with that knowledge? Do we treat these stories as historical curiosities, thrilling tales from a distant war, sanitized and packaged for easy consumption? Or do we recognize them as blueprints for a pattern that repeats every time someone inside a powerful system sees something wrong and decides the cost of speaking up is worth paying? Because the same dynamics are still in play. The same distrust of troublemakers. The same gap between being vilified in real time and vindicated by history. The same tendency to celebrate the lone hero and forget the support network that made the hero possible. If you care more about what actually happened than the comforting myths, the paperwork, the tunnels, the bodies that didn't make the credits, subscribe. This channel exists to follow the real fault lines that changed the war, not the sanitized version, not the version where the costs get edited out and the moral is clean, the version where intelligence is gathered in the dark by people whose names you'll never know, where escapes succeed because civilians risk their families, and where 50 men are executed for trying to go home. If you think these escapes shouldn't stay as footnotes or movie trivia, push this episode a little further. One like, one share. That's how stories outrun the tidy versions that left the cost out. That's how we correct the record and remember the infrastructure, not just the climactic moments. And don't just watch. Use the comments to name the escapees, helpers, and modern troublemakers you think deserve to be remembered. This is where we start correcting who gets written into the story and who doesn't. Because the truth is, most of the people who made these escapes possible were never famous, never celebrated, never even named in the official histories. They were the forgers who died in solitary, the civilians who were executed for offering a meal, the engineers who suffocated in collapsed tunnels, the resistance members who were tortured for information they refused to give. They were the ones who dug the tunnels that failed, who forged the documents that didn't pass inspection, who hid the fugitives who were caught anyway. They were the infrastructure, and without them, none of the celebrated escapes would have happened. So when you remember the Great Escape, remember the 50 who were murdered. When you remember Jan Baalsrud walking out of the Arctic, remember the Norwegian families who sheltered him knowing it could cost them their lives. When you remember Colditz, remember the hundreds of failed attempts that never made it into the mythology. Remember that every success was built on a foundation of failures, sacrifices, and anonymous courage that history didn't bother to record. And ask yourself, when someone in your own time takes a risk to expose a dangerous truth, will you call them a hero or a troublemaker? Because history will decide eventually. The only question is whether you'll recognize them before it's too late to matter.